Hey guys, so today we are going to talk just a little bit about genetic disorders. Now, I think those of you all that have Miss McLean for biology, you all are like right in the middle of genetics, and so this is probably going to be a breeze for you. For those of you that are with me in AP, we do our sequence a little bit different, and so we haven't gotten to genetics. We won't do that until after Christmas. But some of this should be a little bit of review from PBS because we did Punnett squares and some simple things in PBS. And hopefully you remember Punnett squares even from middle school, those little boxes that you put the letters over and you draw inside. Unfortunately, the way that Project Lead the Way uploads this PowerPoint or whatever you want to call it, slideshow into the curriculum, I cannot download it in a way that I can write on it. So I'm really struggling with that here this morning. But let's go ahead and jump right in. You will want to take some notes as I go over this. You don't have to write down every single word that's on this slide, but I'll kind of point out some highlights that are going to be very important to know. So, genetic disorders, it's important to know that disease is caused by a combination of both environmental and genetic factors. So you can have a genetic predisposition for something, but you can make decisions in your lifestyle that amplify that risk or that reduce that risk. And so it's a combination of both that determine your likelihood to develop a certain disease. So, because it's a genetic disorder, it's caused by a abnormality, otherwise known as a mutation, in the genetic material, which would be the DNA. And so remember, DNA is really important because DNA codes for RNA, which codes for proteins, okay? And our proteins give us the physical characteristics that we have. So we're going to talk about 4 different types of genetic disorders: single gene, multifactorial, chromosomal, and mitochondrial. And you'll want to take a couple of notes on each of those as to what that means. Okay? So, single gene disorders. Before we get into disorders, let's talk about single gene traits. Single gene traits are going to be manifested in either that you have them or you don't. There's no middle ground, okay? So a single gene trait would be like you can roll your tongue. Either you can do it or you can't. There's not like I can kind of roll my tongue. Either you can do it or you can't. A widow's peak would be single gene traits. Freckles would be a single gene trait, okay? Single gene disorders are going to be the same thing. Either you have them or you don't. Polydactyly, that's not really a disorder. It's more considered a trait, which means extra fingers or extra toes. You either have a 6th finger on one hand or you don't. There's no middle grounds to that. But it's caused by a change in one gene. So we see this in genetic disorders as well. Things like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, sickle cell anemia. We talked about that a lot in PBS. All of those are single gene disorders, okay? A mutation in one gene, which is on one very small segment of the DNA, causes that, okay? So, ultimately, that gene is mutated, that piece of DNA is mutated, and so you don't produce the protein that's needed to do its job. So, for example, in cystic fibrosis, I know a little guy back home that has cystic fibrosis. And so what happens with these individuals is that they don't produce an enzyme that breaks down mucus, okay? And so that mucus builds up and they have a lot of lung function and pulmonary problems. And so it's because of that lack of enzyme. And for those of you with me in AP, you know that an enzyme is a protein. And so that segment of gene or that segment of DNA called a gene that codes for that protein is messed up. And so the code was made wrong. Therefore, the protein was made wrong or the enzyme was made wrong. And so it can't do its job and they lack that. So, we can see these single gene disorders. There's 3 different patterns of inheritance. It can be an autosomal dominant disorder, okay? Autosome means it's not a sex chromosome. It's one of the other 22 pairs aside from that XY or Y, that 23rd pair of chromosomes. That's what an autosome is. So if it's caused by a dominant disorder, that means somebody with a genotype big A, or big A, little a, would have that disorder. They just have to have one copy of the bad gene to inherit the disorder. Okay? If you have an autosomal dominant disorder and you reproduce, there is a 100% likelihood that you will pass it down to your offspring. Okay? Because, actually, I take that back. That's not true, because if you were big A, little a, you wouldn't necessarily pass down the big A. But there's at least a 50% chance, 50 to 100% chance that you would pass it down. And we can work the Punnett squares out, and if I could use my little pen, I would work the Punnett squares out to show you that. But there's at least a 50% chance that you would pass it down to your offspring, okay? In an autosomal recessive disorder, that means you have to have 2 copies of the bad gene, okay? 2 little a's, little a would give you that disorder, okay? So it's a little bit less likely that you would inherit an autosomal recessive gene. But if both of your parents are carriers for that gene, which oftentimes they may not know, in my little friend with the cystic fibrosis, both of his parents were carriers for cystic fibrosis. And so when you work out that Punnett square, they were both big A, little a. For both parents. And so in that bottom right corner of that Punnett square, he was little a, little a. And so there was a 25% chance of having a child with cystic fibrosis. And their first child was. Now, they went on to have 2 more kids, which is a totally different issue. We'll talk about that. You know, there's ethics and morals and all those things associated with it. And no right or wrong answer. But none of the other 2 kids are fine. They're normal. They do not have cystic fibrosis. So he was the 1 in 25 chance, and the other 2 didn't get that disease. So that's autosomal recessive. And then the last is sex-linked. So sex-linked disorders are on the X or Y chromosome, okay? Are on the X or Y chromosome. And so they are passed down from parents to the offsprings on the 6 chromosomes. And so things like color blindness or male pattern baldness, those are sex-linked disorders. Not disorders, those would be traits. Color blindness would be a disorder, but those would be traits otherwise. Okay? So we can do genetic testing to determine if somebody has a disorder, if they're developed one, or if they are a carrier. And so as people get to reproductive age, even someone like me, I don't have any genetic disorders. I don't know of anybody in my family that has a history of genetic disorders, but I was given that option when I got pregnant with my children if I wanted to have, my DNA scanned or their DNA scanned to see if there was a likelihood of me being a carrier or them developing a genetic disorder. So let's look at this question. A man and a woman are both carriers for sickle cell disease, an autosomal recessive trait. What is the risk of their child and them having an affected child? So if they're both carriers, carrier means that they are big A, little a. Okay? They have the dominant gene, but they also have the recessive gene. And so there's a 25% chance of them passing that on. If you work the Punnett square, you would have big A, little a on the top, big A, little a on the side. And then you would fill out the square, pulling the letters to each of the window panes from the parents, and you would see that they have a 25% chance. Okay? And so that's what this is saying. Okay? Now, on to a multifactorial disorder. A multifactorial disorder is something that's a little bit more complicated. Okay? It involves several different genes. And so, not a disorder, but we can think of these traits to be like hair color. Okay? People aren't just, brown hair or blonde hair or red hair. There's kind of a lot of variations in there, right? And so the same thing are true with multifactorial disorders. And things in the summer like the sun can help bleach out your hair, just like the environment can affect your genes. So heart disease is something that can be passed down in the family. Families have histories of heart disease. But if you exercise and you don't smoke and you eat a balanced diet, you can greatly cut your risk out for that. Okay? Breast cancer is known to be something that's passed down, that's genetic. Colon cancer is also something that's genetic. If you have a history of colon cancer, once you get to a certain age, I think it's like 40, you have to start having screens every 3 to 5 years to see if you have any abnormal cells in your colon. And so there's different environmental and genetic factors that cause these. And so these are multifactorial disorders. Okay. Now, remember, if we look at the chromosomes, some disorders are on the chromosomes, just like we said here with all of the disorders. They're going to be on the chromosomes because chromosomes contain the genetic material or the DNA. So we have 46 chromosomes in our body. 44 of those are autosomes, so those would be autosomal disorders if the disorder was there. And then the 2 sex chromosomes, XX for females, XY for males, are the sex chromosomes, the non-autosomes, the sex chromosomes. And so sometimes in chromosomal disorders, what happens is you have not just one tiny gene that's changed, not just one letter, an A, a T, a G, or a C in our DNA code, because that one letter can cause a difference. We see that in sickle cell anemia. You may remember that from Anna in PBS. Just changing one letter gave her sickle cell anemia, okay? But some people will inherit a whole extra chromosome, or they'll have a whole chunk of a chromosome deleted, okay, a whole segment of it. When you look at the chromosome in the karyotype, you see that one of the chromosomes is much smaller than the other. And so an example of this is trisomy 21, or Down syndrome. People with Down syndrome have a whole extra 21st chromosome. That's what's called trisomy 21. They don't just have 2 of those chromosomes, one from mom and one from dad. They have an extra one. And that's because there was an error in meiosis when those chromosomes divide. Okay? And so some of these disorders we can identify with a karyotype. You've probably all seen a karyotype before. A karyotype is a picture of the chromosomes, and they're laid out 1 to 23. They arrange them by size, so 1 is the longest chromosome. 23 is the sex chromosome. So aside from that, 22 would be the smallest or the shortest chromosomes, and they're paired up. And if there's a chromosomal disorder, you would see that. You would see that there's an extra chromosome in a karyotype. Or you would see that a chromosome is shortened, like it would be missing a chunk. And so these can be used to diagnose genetic disorders. Okay. And then the last type of disorder I want to discuss is a mitochondrial disorder. So a mitochondria is an organelle inside the cell, and its job is cellular respiration. It makes ATP, or energy, from the cell. But like the nucleus, which contains most of the DNA of the cell, the mitochondria also contains DNA. So there's only 3 organelles in the cell that contain DNA. The mitochondria, the nucleus, which contains the bulk of the DNA, and then in plant cells, though not applicable to humans, the chloroplast contains DNA as well. So mitochondrial DNA is passed down from the mom, okay? You don't get any mitochondrial DNA from your dad, okay? So you're always just going to be just a tiny bit more of your mom genetically than you are of your dad. And so any mutations in the mitochondrial DNA are going to be passed down from the mom. The dad doesn't contribute those. And so it's non-chromosomal DNA because it doesn't make up one of those 23 pairs of chromosomes. It's considered a non-chromosomal DNA mutation is a mitochondrial disorder. And those are very rare. You don't see a ton of mitochondrial disorders. Okay? So later this week, you are going to do a presentation of a family. On Wednesday, you are going to be assigned a family that you are going to counsel them genetically. And so tomorrow you're going to start, tomorrow Wednesday, you're going to start learning about your different family. And so this information is going to help you to be able to diagnose the disorder, to understand the different types of genetic disorders, and you're going to choose which of these types your family has and counsel them on what their options are. Okay, so if you have any questions about this, let me know. If you didn't get the Punnett squares and you don't really understand those, let me know that as well, and I can send you some diagrams or help draw those out. You all have a great day.